and do that. Helena, I guess we could probably get started.
Okay, great. That sounds good. So yeah, as Rachel said, welcome to today's session. It's a joint session of the Scholix and the Data Usage Metrics working groups, from data citation to data metrics. My slide's not moving and I'm sharing the slides today. There we go. So yeah, we will start with some introductions, just to kind of give you an update from both groups. And then we're very happy that we have 3 guest presentations today. So thanks a lot to the presenters for joining us and sharing their work and experience with us. And then there will be some time to discuss next steps in the future and what's next and what other things we want to do. So really the thinking behind these groups is around how can we incentivize data sharing. Clearly, it's a very big topic and it has been for a while now. But still, there is so much more work to do and so much more that can happen in terms of data sharing. And so it's very easy that we make it easy and we demonstrate impact. And both the Scholix and the Data Usage Metrics working group aim to contribute to that and work on lowering the technical barriers, so contribute to the infrastructure, but also enable responsible reporting. And so first you will get a brief introduction from the Data Usage Metrics group. So I don't know, Ian, is that going to be you?
It is indeed, yes, thank you,
Very good.
Helena. And so this is going to be a relatively brief overview, and it's given on behalf of myself and co-chair Daniela Lowenberg. The group, I think it was the sort of final proposition was established in 2018, and the idea was that by adopting data usage metrics that we would be able to better recognize research data as a first-class research output, and that a number of stakeholders, researchers, funders, publishers, and institutions would all benefit from metrics that can reliably reflect impact. And I think that word reliably is quite important. We had a series of meetings over various RDA plenaries, which took us up to this year, and a set of recommendations that we sort of finalized and submitted sort of for approval. Now, if you go to the next slide, the recommendations are relatively straightforward, and I have condensed them down onto this one side. The first observation we made is that there is a lot of interest within the community in this particular topic. This was sort of caveated by it's complicated and there are activation barriers, because although you know, we got a lot of interest at plenary meetings about this, I think we sensed that not just at sort of in terms of developing standards and things like that, but in terms of people implementing these things, it wasn't always top of people's list of priorities to do. That said, there are tools out there that can help and should be adopted where appropriate. I think as this group was running, it overlapped with work that was going on to develop the counter code of practice for reporting views and downloads of data sets. I think it's important to clarify that, because obviously there's counter that some of you will be aware of for sort of journal article usage. This is a code of practice that has been developed specifically for data sets. And a project called Make Data Count, which was coming up with recommendations for reporting, which was to adopt this, but also take advantage of a service being provided by DataCite to aggregate usage reports. And I think we'll hear a little bit more about that later. The other thing the recommendations observe is that data usage is nuanced, and we have to be very careful to avoid defaulting to the equivalent of a data impact factor. The sort of sense that that would be a really bad idea. And a lot of the discussion in the process of sort of coming up with these recommendations was around the specific challenges that different people may experience around sort of reliably reflecting how data is being used just through views and downloads. And then the final one is that there's work still to be done to understand and overcome those shortcomings. Sadly, we weren't able to do that within the course of this group, and that there should continue to be some kind of presence within RDA working closely with Scholix. So kind of here we are today. The next slide. This is where I think I hand over to Christian, who's going to talk a little bit about that sort of usage reporting piece of this.
Thank you, Ian. Well, as Ian mentioned earlier, I mean, adoption of usage metrics is necessary for the recognition of research data as first-class research output, but adoption has been a major challenge. As mentioned there, there have been activation barriers for repositories when they are trying to report views and downloads. Many people in this group have been working towards identifying those problems, those activation barriers. And I mean, here I have a list of them. So on one side, repositories are worried about exposing personal identifying information when these usages are shared. There is also the burden of the processing web logs to generate user statistics by the council repositories. And actually making this process by repository processing usage sets is actually very cumbersome. Moreover, there are few open source solutions that can accommodate the control code of practice requirements at this point. And there are even fewer that can provide a service that removes the burden from the repositories. I think we can go to the next one. Therefore, many players in this community, also people from the project Make the Count, have been proposing an approach on providing a hosted service that is based and will continue to be open source. This service, we expect to lower the barrier to adoption by using an alternative approach to the normal approach that the counter suggests. And this is based on JavaScript trackers, an approach that many of us in this room have already used for other websites or repositories. And DataSite has been working over the last year on providing a service following this approach while being compliant with the control code of practice, and also by taking into consideration all the concerns that everybody has about storing personalized identifying information. So as of today, that service is in development, and we are expected to have a proof of concept in a few weeks time, probably by the end of the year. And repositories such as Trial, there are participants of this, have been already to be one of the first ones to validate and test this proof of concept. Based on the results of that, I think that from early 2022 and throughout the year, we have a number of releases or response that will help us to validate that this service works. And the result is that it was expected to remove those barriers that we have identified, that this group has been identifying over the last couple of years, with regards to adoption. And I guess that's the update with regards to that, which is barriers that we want to eliminate. And in that case, in that sense, I can probably hand over to Ian again. Thanks. I think you're muted. Yeah.
Spotted. You missed me saying how this looks like a very interesting sort of like development and a way to help lower the barriers to sort of like capturing this information. So thank you. This I think is my final slide, which just gives sort of current status of where we are. The recommendations have been published. We're still awaiting formal endorsement through the Research Data Alliance. I think the key thing we need to get together is some examples of adoption stories. So if there are people who have been following the Make Data Count guidelines and adopting some of the counter reporting, and you feel that you are sort of living by those recommendations that are out there, please do let us know, so that we can add you to the list of potential adopters for this. We do know of people who have done this, so it's not like we're desperately seeking around for people who have done this, but obviously the more we have, the better. And in terms of the recommendation that this group continue in some shape or form, I think that's discussion still to be had within RDA, but we hope to be able to sort of facilitate continued discussions in that area. And I hope there I've done the activity of the data usage metrics group justice.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, thanks, Ian and Christian. Obviously, I can't see the chat, so I don't know if there are any questions or just people introducing themselves. So maybe someone can let me know.
Moment. So Andrea, thank you for sharing the link to the recommendations, but no questions at the moment.
Okay, good. And I guess we can move on to the slides from the Scholix group. Like Ian, I'm also presenting these on behalf of the co-chairs, so Rachel Lemmy from Crossref, Lorenzo Ferri from Elsevier, and Paolo Monkey from OpenAir, who are all on the line as well, and who you'll also hear from in this session. So I think probably many of you are familiar with Scholix. I feel I've seen many of you before in other sessions, but just to make sure that we all have the same understanding and we're on the same page, we did want to sort of go back to the basics and explain what Scholix is and does. And so Scholix stands for Scholarly Link Exchange, and it's a framework standardizing the exchange of scholarly link information. And so far, the focus has been on the links between articles and datasets, but that is actually one of the discussion topics on the agenda today. And it provides an information model for scholarly link representation and a recommendation and provision of exchange formats and protocols. And so one of the things that has come out of the Scholix group is a schema which provide guidance on how to actually exchange information about the links between articles and datasets. So you have the source object, which can either be an article or a dataset, and there's information about that. And you have a target object, which can be an article or a dataset and information about that. And then you provide information about the relationship between these two outputs. And so what that addresses, the reason why we were working on the problem in this group, is that there were many disconnected sources that had some pieces of information. But if you wanted any of the information from the other sources, then you just had to sort of call them up directly and say, hey, do you know anything about this? Can we establish a link? Which was clearly not very efficient. And so that's something we've been addressing through this work, is to have a standard set of guidelines for exposing and consuming links. And so the way we've been doing that is through different hubs. And so these are existing hubs, so OpenAir, Crossref, and Scholix. And so different stakeholders in the community can contribute information they have about these links to these hubs. And there can be other hubs as well. Anyone that that is collecting information about the links between articles and datasets, and then exposes that in line with the Scholix framework and schema, can be a Scholix hub. And so because we all do this in the same way, we exchange information in the same way, it all becomes available to the community in an open way. And how this information can be contributed to the hubs, and this is an example from Crossref and DataCite. So for example, with Crossref, the Crossref members, often publishers, when they register a DOI, they deposit metadata with Crossref. And then in that metadata, they can include information they have about associated datasets. So when they know there's this dataset that underlies this article, they can include a related identifier. And so they can say, okay, this dataset with this DOI, this article that we're now registering a DOI for actually references this dataset. And then that information can be made available in a Scholix format. And the same for DataCite members, often repositories, they also deposit metadata, and they can also say, okay, I know that there is this article that's based on this dataset, and this dataset is supplement to, or is referenced by, or cited by this article, and that information then also feeds into the system. And the publishers this way also know about the information the repository has, and the repository knows about the information the publishers have. And this can all be queried. As I said, it's all openly available. And so then it can also be displayed. So maybe in this case, CCDC actually knew about the relationship between the article and the data set. They made this available through Scholix, and then the publisher was able to query it and make the information available with the article. And then I also wanted to mention, because this session is called From Citations to Metrics, that having this information about these links between articles and datasets also provides a way to start looking at citations and how often and whether datasets are cited by articles. And so here you see an example. This is a Dryad dataset. There was a citation detected, and this can then be displayed next to other usage information such as views and downloads. So Scholix has been around for a while now. Maybe some of you have been going to these working group meetings for many years. So the group started in 2014 as the data publishing working group. It became the Scholix working group, and the interoperability framework and the schema were developed. And then for the last couple of years, we've really been focusing on adoption, because that's a really important piece. The information only really becomes valuable when sufficient information is put into the system. And so we have been in maintenance mode, but we are still active. We still meet every month. If you're not yet part of that, but you're interested in that, you can basically just share your email address in the chat and we can add you to the list so that you get the invitation. We're very happy to welcome additional people to discuss adoption and next steps with us. So today we will also really focus on, well, adoption stories, but also sort of things that can be built on the work that has already been done. And after that, we will be discussing next steps. So I think with that, I will stop sharing my screen and I will hand over to our first speaker, Scott. So Scott, are you able to
Thanks, Helena.
share your
Yes,
screen?
I will share my screen and get started. Wish good afternoon and morning to everybody. So I was invited to speak with you by Joris van Rossum. And Joris was working on behalf of the STM, Scientific, Technical, and Medical Association of Publishers, on the 2020 research data year. And that effort really focused on getting publishers on board as implementers, particularly with the data availability statement and with data citations, supporting better workflows for data citations. And Optica, which you may not know us by that name, we used to be the Optical Society, and we've recently rebranded ourselves as Optica, as a more global name. We were very active and interested in making progress in 2020 and 2021. So Joris thought it would be useful for me to address this group, talk about how we were active with trying to support Scholix. Just a little bit more about us, the Optica Publishing Group, formerly OSA. We publish journals in the areas of optics and photonics. You can see some pictures there indicating that this is, biomedical imaging and telecommunications, lasers, astronomy, just very multidisciplinary, and lots of data in many, many different communities, lots of software used in our referenced in our journal articles. So our main two efforts were around data availability statement and data citations. So I'll talk about those a little bit. Here's a view of one of our journal articles. And as of March 1st, 2021, we do require a data availability statement in every paper. We will not publish a paper as of this year without a data availability statement. And that it took us about a year to get a policy in place that our different governing boards were comfortable with. And so let me give you just a few statistics, or first a look at the data availability statement, then a few statistics. This is a data availability statement that indicates that two things: that the paper had a data set that was integral to the paper, which isn't necessary for citing a data set in our journals, but that means that the data set was even more important. And then also the data sets are being cited, as you see here. So both the HTML representation of the article and the PDF will have mention of the data, how it was used, and references. And we are trying to use the data site recommendations to format the references, as you see there. One of the benefits of participating in the Scholix activity and knowing what the goals were is it really forced some decisions from us about how to treat the data citations in the process. So here's a citation that we marked as a data citation. So what does that mean? It means we looked at that data citation and it didn't require a password to get the data set. It wasn't just on somebody's Google Drive. And we get a lot of those submitted. They get all the way through peer review. And then production looks at the paper and we find that the data set is, on a Dropbox or something, or it's embargoed. So our production staff, we look really carefully at all the data sets. And if they're not compliant and if the authors can't be compliant, we don't mark it as a data set. We don't add that tag that you see in green there. It may sound like a small thing, but it's actually quite a big effort for us to do it. And one reason we're doing it is so that we can put into Crossref only a record for items that really deserve to be part of the scholarly infrastructure, be cited. Here's just a snippet of what we give to Crossref. Eventually, Crossref will support some additional descriptive information about the type of object it is. But currently, we understand we're compliant and supplying the type of information you see there. It's very brief. It does include a DOI. We don't supply anything to Crossref that doesn't have a DOI like this. So next, a few statistics about our data availability statement and what the uptake was. You might find this interesting. We were a little surprised by it. 100% of our journal articles, research articles, must have a data availability statement, but 90% of them look like this. We use data, it's not publicly available, contact us. A little more than 5% of these data availability statements have a reference to a cited data source. And the remainders have some variation of this statement. We didn't use or generate, analyze or generate data in this paper. So just a little over 5% of papers are referencing publicly available research data. Yeah, I just have one more slide, but it's an important one because when Joris asked me to speak, he said, tell the group why you wanted to participate in Scholix. And I haven't done that yet, so maybe this will be the final slide on that. Well, when we were aware of what Scholix was trying to do, what DataCite was trying to do, what Crossref was trying to do, that really helped clarify what we should tell our authors about what to put in the DAS and how to form their code and data citations. And as I showed you, we do take a lot of extra effort when we have a data citation to style it correctly, tag it, make sure that it's compliant, have indexing requirements that they can be met, or it's not tagged as a data citation. I realize that one reason we're all doing this activity is so that contributors have a better chance of being recognized for their contributions with data and code. There's been a few cases where a researcher said, somebody just mentioned my code X number of times in the paper and didn't cite it once. That's not a way to give me credit for this contribution I made to this area. And we're hoping that just over 5% will continue to grow now that there's a lot of focus on including public data sets with research articles in our journals. That a data availability statement is very visible. It's in front of the paywall. It can be indexed by a lot of the groups that, Google Scholar and others. And we will be putting more and more data into Crossref as well. So that's all I had this morning. I'll stop sharing. Thank you.
Yes, thanks a lot, Scott. I think that was really good overview. Are there any questions for Scott at this point? Okay, well, if any questions come up, then feel free to put them in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on that.
Scott, it's Paolo here. Can I have a question?
Yeah, sure.
So thanks for your presentation. So you just described your intention. I'm not sure if this is already the case, but hopefully it will be to expose your Scholix links to Crossref event data or similar, right? But are you planning also to do the vice versa? So basically track links from your papers to data sets you may not be aware of, or the evolution of such links, or getting back something, not just providing, but getting back something, information about the links from.
Earlier, Helena showed a slide where a publisher was doing just that, had a paper published, but was able to tap into Scholix and retrieve links. I think absolutely, we would love to do that. I took notice of that slide. I mean, I was aware of the idea, but the more I see an example of that, the more compelling it is. So yeah, I think that it is definitely something publishers like us will be interested in doing.
And I think part of Paolo's point, at least how I interpreted it, is that it's also information that changes over time. So it's dynamic information in a way where the information may not be available at the time of article publication, but maybe in a year's time there will be new information added. And so if you sort of continue to query the system, then you could be adding that new information.
I'm telling you, we have DAS statements that say the data used in this study are not available at this time.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So they're either under embargo or there's some other reason, but they might be in the future. So yeah, that's a good use case.
I see some comments in the chat. Yeah, Maggie saying
has her hand up.
Ah, good. Let's go to Kirsten first.
Okay, thanks, Helena. I would like to follow on Paolo's question because I'm one of the users of Scholix because we are linked to this Elsevier implementation of Scholix, which means that when we cite a paper in one of our data publications, I'm working at GFZ in Germany, and the paper has been published in Elsevier. Mostly a link to the data pops up some weeks later because they're automatically connected to the Scholar Explorer where they can find new citations to existing data. And this is something that is extremely interesting for our researchers, and they keep thinking about potential data they could publish that they have not yet published just to get this connection from their papers. And I always think it would be, this is for me a practice example of how it can work, how Scholix can benefit and really make the links from data to papers, even though the papers were published possibly years before. We do lots of data compilations with old data sets, and it's really great to see these links. What would be very interesting for me as a repository manager for data publications to use, like, to find out this, how many, like when I publish a data, I would like to know how many times has this data been cited in papers in the future. And I know that we can retrieve this information from Scholix. And I also know that DataCite has sometimes notifications on this data has been cited so many times. But are you considering in developing like an API that I as a repository can like connect to, where I get actual updates and that I can possibly display on my DOI landing pages for data, because this would just be the other way around.
This is already the case. This is already the case. So the APIs of Scholar Explorer do exactly that. Scopus uses the APIs for this purpose. So
Okay.
When you open an article in Scopus, a request to the Scholar Explorer is sent, and you get the latest list of objects connected to that persistent identifier. We're dealing with all persistent identifiers, but the interesting thing is that we're collecting from EBI, EMBO, for example. So we have all the links to the bioentities and the papers. We have all the links to the PMC IDs, to the archive IDs. So we consider many known IDs as persistent identifiers. And the kind of links that we are collecting come sometimes from the data sources where the objects have been published, sometimes from the end users because they add them later on. You know, they add like a citation, or sometimes we infer them. So a good example will come later with the links to software. So given a DOI, you can reach out now to many software published in repositories like Zenodo, but also in GitHub, Bitbucket, and so on, because of the inference process behind it. So there are several benefits, let's say, in having access to the dynamic view of your persistent identifier, let's say, how it is related to the world.
But how can I make this visible on my landing pages at GFZ?
You just execute a query on the APIs given a persistent identifier and like a DOI, and you get back a snippet with, typically, I think it's a list of DOIs, title, author's date, something like that. So what is
the DOIs,
needed,
once I have them, I can retrieve the,
I think it's a Scholix what you get back. So it's the minimal amount of information that you need to show it nicely in a page. We do it in our repository, in our institution also, because it's, of course, because we did it.
Okay, great, thanks.
So I see also a question for Scott in the chat. So Scott, is there scope to flag when the embargo will end in cases where authors say that they can't make the data available at this time?
We don't really have a program to update the status of data availability statement. I suppose if an author was really sure about when the embargo expired, that could be part of the text that was in the DAS. But I think the program Paolo is talking about is where it's more dynamic is really what's going to be needed, especially with data sets, given their nature. And most of the publishers are already used to doing this with citations. There's the Crossref cited by service, where you go to an article and you can see all the papers that have cited that article. I mean, the universe of where the data sets and code are going to live is much more diverse, of course, than where the citing articles are going to live. Okay, so just one last thing, then we can move on. This is a good question, and it's something that we're going to probably debate at the end of the session. But ideally, we can extend Scholar Explorer. We actually already do, to include all citations, open citations, at least from paper to paper. So, and we can publish this as a dump. We already do. So it's possible to have in one place all links between articles and articles dataset and article software. So you can imagine you can come up with any sort of indicator in that sense. And I think this is another interesting point of view, what we can do with this kind of links and citations once they are all together.
Okay, great. Thanks everyone for these contributions. I think, Rachel, you have the next presentation.
Yes, I do. So let me try to get this up and running. So the next presentation is from Catherine Brady, who's a program manager at Australian Research Data Commons. Obviously, it's the middle of the night for them, so they've kindly sent us a recording. Adrian Burton and Natasha Simons are sort of also involved in the Scholix work, and again we just thought it would be useful to have a really quick presentation just about some of the things again that real world use cases and how they're trying to use Scholix, and I think by extension sort of data usage metrics in the work that they're doing to support the multiple projects that they're involved in. Let me press play. Let me know if the sound does or doesn't work, and I can tweak things from there if needs be.
Welcome Welcome to this presentation on reporting outcomes and impacts for national data assets projects. My name is Catherine Brady, and I'm the Program Manager for the Australian Data Partnerships Program under the National Data Assets Initiative. The Australian Research Data Commons enables the Australian research community and industry access to nationally significant data-intensive digital research infrastructure, platforms, skills, and collections of high-quality data. Improving the ways we collect, store, and share and use data within and across research domains builds resilience for Australia, empowering our society to prepare for, manage, and emerge from global scale challenges as a stronger and more agile nation. The ARDC is well placed to address these data challenges as the only national organisation dedicated to providing Australian researchers with competitive advantage through data. Our mission is to accelerate research and innovation by driving excellence in the creation, analysis, and retention of high-quality data assets that lead to social, economic, and environmental benefits locally and internationally. In 2020, the ARDC commissioned a project investigating the link between research data and impact, Phase 2, to investigate and identify patterns of how research data leads to non-academic impact, including social, economic, environmental, and cultural impact and health benefits. The project used 246 Australian case studies from the Australian Research Council's Engagement and Impact Assessment 2018. It focused on data-intense cases and using content analysis looked for patterns that linked research data and impact. The project expanded on research commissioned in 2019, the Phase 1 of this study, that looked at case studies from UK Research Excellence Framework. The new study suggested that greater impact could be achieved through closer links and capacity building in order to generate better connections between researchers, government, and industry. Phase 2 sought to identify the impact of research outside academia. Research data was found to deliver positive results in professional practice, government, economics, and public health. The study identified contributing pathways to impacts, including the development of improved institutional processes, reports, and analytical methods. The study also found that research data rarely generated positive benefits on its own. The authors noted that data needs to be processed and conclusions or other value need to be drawn from them so that they can yield non-academic impacts. The study also aimed to identify the beneficiaries of research impact. It found that government, policy, or policymakers, industry or business, and specific public groups such as hospital patients received the most benefits. As a national research infrastructure provider, the ARDC facilitates partnerships to develop a coherent research environment that enables researchers to find, access, contribute to, and effectively use services to maximise research quality and impact. The National Data Assets Initiative is a strategic activity under the ARDC's Data and Services theme. Over the years 2019 to 2022, this initiative will enable the ARDC to establish strategic partnerships with research communities and institutions to develop a portfolio of national-scale data assets that support leading-edge research. This approach will create long-lived data assets that leverage existing research and administrative investment to ensure ongoing sustainability and stewardship. The National Data Assets Initiative seeks to catalyse research translation to produce benefits for communities beyond the research sector. Underpinning this initiative is the principle that collections of data can be national research infrastructure when they support leading-edge research and are national in scale. The programs in this National Data Assets Initiative seek to ensure a balanced portfolio of data custodians, beneficiaries, data collection maturity types, and research system outcomes. In seeking to capture the outcomes and impacts of ARDC investment in these partnerships, the National Data Assets Initiative is using the CSIRO Impact Framework to conceptualize the transformation from project inputs to impacts. National data assets projects are asked to plan, implement and report on research outcomes and impact from ARDC invested activities at 12 and 24 months after project completion. The report may cover any research outcome or broader impact produced through the use of the ARDC invested data asset or infrastructure. For research outcomes, this could include publications, grants, projects, patents, reports, licenses, usage, citations, user satisfaction, training, and evidence of reuse. For broader impact, this might be any demonstrated social, economic, environmental, cultural, and health impact produced through the use of the ARDC invested data asset or infrastructure. The ARDC is supporting the projects in this by leading a working group to look at the challenge of how to track, measure and report on outcomes and impacts of the data infrastructure beyond the project phase. The projects under the National Data Assets Initiative have used the OECD framework for assessing the scientific and socio-economic impact of research infrastructure to guide the selection of indicators to form part of their own customised monitoring framework. In addition, the ARDC is co-investing in the development of systems, policies and procedures required for the projects to implement those monitoring systems where that infrastructure is not available or not fit for purpose within their organisations or institutions. The ARDC is keen to use the Scholix infrastructure between Crossref and DataCite to pick up mentions of data in publications. The ARDC is inviting the Scholix chairs to speak to the working group, and we will be assisting our membership to craft work packages that utilise the existing infrastructure where at all possible. We'll also be working with our projects to leverage their existing relationships with publishers to help them implement the Scholix guidelines. We look forward to updating you on our progress in future, and we welcome any feedback or comments. Thank you.
Cool. So I think is that obviously Catherine can't be with us. Catherine can't be with us on the call, but I think that certainly I know that we're keen to kind of follow along at home and see how that work goes. You know, what are people doing and what the impact of it is certainly key to both obviously data citation and then the use of this information further down the track. I was going to suggest that we pass control over to Kathleen from Dans in the Netherlands and also the Scholcom lab in Canada, because Kathleen, I feel like you've really sort of had to roll your sleeves up and get to grips with a lot of this information and sort of see how far you can get in terms of making inferences on that. So thank you for agreeing to share that with the group today, and I'll hand control over to you.
Sure, thanks very much, Rachel. Let me just share my screen. And hopefully we're seeing all of this. Yeah, well, thanks. Yeah, thanks very much for the chance to come and speak to both groups today in these different contexts. It's nice to kind of bring the two together. As Rachel said, I am a postdoctoral researcher right now at both Dans in the Netherlands and also at the Scholcom lab in Canada at the University of Ottawa. And although I've been lurking around these groups for a while, this is actually my first chance to actually speak to you. And I'm going to speak about a new project that I've become involved in at the Scholcom lab, where we're investigating data citations from a little bit of a different perspective than what we normally talk about at RDA, or what we talk about, I think, when we're thinking about data sharing and data reuse and data citation. And that's kind of normally we're thinking about things, and this is what I've heard in the presentation so far, from for example, the research perspective, where we're talking about data citations being a way to help researchers themselves discover data or to help them kind of verify claims that they might find in the literature. And another perspective that I've also heard today is kind of more credit and attribution perspective, where we're thinking about citations and metrics as being a way of giving credit to people for their work, for producing and managing and sharing their data, but also potentially as a way to monitor or evaluate how data have been used from the repository standpoint, or repositories who want to think about the impact of their data. But also you could think of about this perspective from a more funding perspective, where you have funders who are interested also in thinking about how their funded projects and the resulting data might be impacting society or scholarly works. But the final perspective here on the slide is a perspective that is not always present at RDA. And this is more of the bibliometric perspective. So the perspective of bibliometricians whose job it is, whose scholarly field it is, to kind of study patterns in scholarly communication by tracing publications, by understanding citation practices and the related metadata to various different scholarly outputs and in various different outlets, journals, conference proceedings, but also more informal types of outlets. So to kind of bring together these perspectives, this perspective of the bibliometricians, as well as the perspective of the research data community, I have become involved in a new project called the Meaningful Data Counts project that's being run out of the Scholix lab and is being led by Stephanie Haustein and Isabella Peters, and also involves myself and Anton Ninkov as a postdoc. And this project is a sister project, I guess you would say, to the Make Data Counts initiative, where we are really aiming to bring together different methods, bibliometrics methods, but also methods such as a survey and more qualitative research to understand citation practices and also the motivation behind these practices of citation and data sharing. So we really are aiming to kind of map the landscape, but also to understand the practices by providing context around any patterns that we might find. And it's kind of in this first steps of this project that, as Rachel said, we've kind of been rolling up our sleeves and things have been getting a little bit messy. So as we know, an important part of understanding data practices, whether we're talking about data sharing or data reuse, is understanding the disciplinary norms of different communities. This is also a really important bit of understanding context from a bibliometrics perspective. The first step in many bibliometric studies, and here's just an example of one of these types of maps that's often produced in bibliometrics and scientific research. But one of the very first important steps is often kind of analyzing the publication patterns or citation patterns from a disciplinary perspective. And this is because we know that knowledge production and citation is different in different disciplinary domains. You can think of, for example, humanities scholars who might publish, one chapter per year and be a sole author on that publication, versus in the extreme case of higher energy physics, where you have this kind of culture of hyper authorship, where you have long lists of authors on particular papers. So this disciplinary perspective is very important for bibliometric studies, but it also makes kind of bibliometric analysis of data challenging. So the problem that we've been running into on our project is that we really don't have a lot of this disciplinary data or disciplinary metadata assigned to particular data or data sets. So as a first step in our project, we've been mapping kind of the state of the data site corpus. And my colleague Anton Ninkov has actually developed a Jupyter notebook, which is openly available. There's a link to it at the last slide here. And we're using this notebook to kind of pull real-time data from data site. And we've used that to map kind of the evolution of this corpus and data site over the last 6 months. And also to look at the disciplinary state of the disciplinary metadata in that corpus. And we've seen changes in the corpus. Since we started mapping this corpus, we've seen about 2.5 million data sets have been added to data site since January. But we've also seen that the percentage of those data sets that have disciplinary information tagged on them is quite low. It's kind of hovering around a little bit below 6% in these last 6 months. And one of those reasons is, of course, because the subject field in the DataCite metadata schema is not actually a required field, which complicates our analysis for sure, but it also kind of complicates understanding of data from a disciplinary perspective for other perspectives also. So looking at that 6% of data in DataCite that has disciplinary information associated with it, we see actually a great variation. So we see different classification schemas being used to assign subjects and disciplinary information, ranging from the OECD classification schema to more localized schemas like the Narcissus classification schema in the Netherlands. And there's also a great difference in the granularity of those different schemas that are used to describe the disciplines of data. So we have more general ones, such as OECD, which has maybe 31 different classifications for disciplinary domain, to much more specific categories, such as, for example, in the Australia-New Zealand classification schema. We also see that this subject field in DataCite is not always actually being used in a controlled way. So some of the information that is in there is just keywords in the subject field, and those keywords may be not so relevant to determine disciplinary domain. They include things just like terms like methods or observables or parameters. So this also complicates understanding the disciplinary nature of this data. But we can see some patterns. So we looked at that small percentage that actually does have disciplinary information. And we can see here, this is according to the OECD classification schema, that the majority of disciplines with data are stemming from what is called the natural sciences. It includes things like biological sciences, chemical sciences, mathematics, followed by the medical and health professions and the social sciences in yellow. But while we're starting to see some kind of disciplinary types of patterns, it's only this very, very small set of the overall corpus. So thinking about this problem led us to thinking about ways we might actually try to tackle solving this problem of getting more disciplinary information. So we first started thinking about, okay, how is this information actually attached to data? So we reviewed the literature and we came up with 3 kind of different approaches for assigning disciplinary information. The first of which we can think of as being an intellectual process, where it's more of a manual practice where researchers who are uploading their data actually assign a disciplinary domain to their data, or perhaps archival staff or curatorial staff at a data archive might go through and actually control the data a little bit and add a disciplinary domain. But this process, as you can imagine, and as I think we got a feel for a little bit in Scott's talk earlier, involves a lot of work. It's laborious, it takes time, but perhaps it's more precise because of that, as it involves people who are really close to the data. But I'll just want to show 2 examples because it shows that even though this process of intellectual assignment of disciplinary data may seem straightforward, there's actually a lot of variation in how it's done and also in what it means. So I take 2 examples here for repositories whom I work with, and I think they're great repositories and doing a very good job, but they're just examples of difference. So for example, in Dryad, authors, when they upload a data set, can choose from this controlled vocabulary from OECD classification of the research domain for their data. But as a researcher who's uploading their data, there's no further instruction given here. I would think a researcher might assume that this might apply to the subject of what the data is actually about, or perhaps it would apply to the domain, my own domain of expertise. So there's not really any further instruction about what the research domain actually refers to when this is assigned from a researcher perspective. At Dance, my other example, which I'm also affiliated with, there's some instructions, but it's from a different perspective. So this subject classification schema that we see here is the narcissist classification, and it appears for the depositor in the audience field. And the depositor is given the instruction that they should assign a discipline for domains to whom the data site might be relevant. So the researcher then has to kind of, one, we presume that they actually know who those relevant communities are. And yeah, that might actually take some work on the part of the researcher. So although there are probably overlaps actually in these two different perspectives, they're not exactly the same. So when we look at data set with the disciplinary domain, that also bears to keep in mind that it actually is assigned in a different context and might have a slightly different meaning. So the second way that disciplinary information is assigned to data that we've identified is what we can call an algorithmic type of process, which is something that's automated. It's based on existing metadata, so often drawn from abstracts or related papers or other subject headings. And then this related information can be fed into machine learning algorithms, and the disciplinary domain of a related data set can be extracted from that and assigned that way. As you can see from, that was a very high level overview of that, but as you can see from the dates on these papers, this is a new area of research. There's, I think, lots of work being done here right now as people are experimenting with new ways to extract that disciplinary information from the data, or from these related types of metadata and documents. And then the third and final one that I'll just mention here is more of a proxy method. And this is where the disciplinary domain of data is inferred, as Paolo said earlier, from other information that is a little bit external to the data themselves. So for example, the subject or the discipline of data might be inferred from the repository where it is assigned. And this kind of proxy method is something that bibliometricians in particular are very well acquainted with, as this is a method that's historically been used in scientometric and bibliometric research, where the discipline of a journal for example, is taken to mean the disciplinary domain of an article or the domain of the researcher themselves, although there are many other more bottom-up approaches used in bibliometrics right now. So just the final slide, I wanted to give an example of this kind of proxy method, as this is something that's underlying a lot of the bibliometric research that's been done outside of our project. Most of the research that's been making statements about disciplinary practices of data citation is built on what's called the Data Citation Index, which is a database from Clarivate, and perhaps we're familiar with it here. But essentially, Clarivate is indexing data from selected repositories, and those repositories are assigned a disciplinary domain as a whole. Every data set or every piece of data that is part of that repository then gets the same classification as the repository itself. So it's just an example of how this process of proxy of assignment of disciplinary domain would work. So to conclude, these, and this was 13 minutes, I think I promised 15. So to conclude, I would say thinking about these different methods of assigning disciplinary domains to data sets helps us to identify the work that actually needs to be done. And this is work that needs to be done by different stakeholders. As in order to kind of have the context we need for understanding data citations and understanding data citation practices, we really need to have this disciplinary information. So some work is already being done. For example, at DataCite, there's work that's being done to map different classification schemas to each other. So that is becoming more standardized. But there's also work to be done on the part of metadata providers, be they researchers who are uploading their data, be they repositories, be they publishers, to work toward having complete metadata records that include this type of disciplinary information. And also to make those processes of how the disciplinary domain of data is assigned more transparent, as that also helps to provide the context that we need in order to understand these practices in a little bit more detail. So with that, I will end and maybe stop sharing my screen also and just, yeah, turn it back over to you, Rachel and Helena.
I see multiple hands up, so shall we start with Kirsten?
I think I was after Polo, but I have the question. On one hand, I think it is quite difficult to find a real disciplinary, like a vocabulary with science disciplines, which would be extremely helpful for your sorting out. But what we do in the geosciences, we try to include SCOS and RDF format vocabularies, and they at least guarantee to always link to the definition of the terms, and this can then be automatically assessed and even compared if the word I use here is the very same that another repository is using. Wouldn't such kind of recommendation be more helpful for you, or helpful in any case?
I think it's definitely helpful, and I think you're putting your finger on one of the main problems that we're facing, and that is in determining which type of classification schema to analyze this DataCite corpus through in all these different types of disciplines and at which level of granularity, right? So we know that there are many different metadata schemas that are being used within data repositories, but kind of our challenge right now is finding the one that has the right level of granularity as well as broad enough to compare across different disciplines. It's the same, I feel this is a very similar conversation that we have in lots of different groups at RDA. And yeah, and I like your idea of linking it using RDF, right, to the exact term. I'm not sure exactly how that comes into play in the types of analysis that we're doing, but that's definitely something to take forward. And I think the final point that I might say also up to this is that I find that as we're going forward, we're dealing not only with the diversity of classification schemas in research data repositories, but we're also dealing with kind of the tradition in bibliometric research for which classification schemas have been used to study citation practices of different sorts. Because we also kind of want to compare our findings to citations to other things, which have been analyzed using different classifications. So don't know that answered your question, but
yeah, it does answer, but I guess you won't find the one and only schema. So because people are doing it for ages, and they have, whenever they start, nothing is rich enough. So I think it could be more successful to make sure that you have some comparable, or like some pathway through all these vocabularies that you can identify and do with like automatic mapping, like more ontology based. But yeah,
I see. Yeah, and that is something that I think at DataCite that I know is also being done, as I mentioned, this kind of mapping between vocabularies. And the more we work, we see that this is a desirable outcome from this project that I'm working on, is maybe to publish some type of open mapping like this between these different vocabularies, to make this kind of bridge like you're talking about, and to make that more transparent so that other people don't necessarily have to go through what we're going through.
Okay, Paolo.
Hello, Kathleen. Good to see you again.
Hi, Paolo.
Well, I had two questions. You just answered one of the two, because it's always interesting to share this kind of mapping across different vocabularies, and possibly to make them open so that people can contribute to them, so help you maintaining them. At the same time, you can share them. There are things in the EOSC going on about this, and it would be interesting to study that. The other thing that I want to tell you is that maybe, unless the proxy approach includes that, but I'm not sure from the way you described it, there's another approach, which is the one of collecting the subjects at the DOI level from other data sources. For example, in OpenAIRE, we are enriching the DOIs with different kind of vocabularies, standard vocabularies, after mining, after the duplication, collecting these values from other objects which are stored somewhere else but are in fact the same, and so on. So each record can be de facto enriched thanks to that. So we'd be happy actually to return you, for example, all the data side UIs enriched with what we have in terms of subject. This is something that we can offer as a service. It's already there. And you may find it interesting. So each of them actually has some information about the inference and the level of trust that it has and so on. So you may select those that are more trustable than others, but I think it's also another approach that you can consider.
Yeah, thanks very much, Paolo. I suppose that could be broadly lumped into one of my categories that I was talking about, maybe in a more automatic or algorithmic approach, but that's not, we haven't really talked about that on our project team actually as a way to add in that type of disciplinary information. So that's something I am going to take back also and discuss more with the team. So yeah, thanks for that. And then if it's okay, maybe I'll follow up.
This is really something that you can do tomorrow, right? So you can collect the UIs and explore the subjects that we have. We can take these offline, but there are nice techniques that you can also apply internally. For example, to propagate these subjects from one object to another, because they are related by good semantics or safe semantics via relationships. So you can say move, migrate, transfer, propagate the context from one object to another.
Okay, yeah, great. We'll definitely talk about that more then. Thank you.
Happy to.
I think, Maggie, I saw your hand up at some point. Did you have a question or has it already been answered?
Well, I was a bit hesitant on whether it was on topic or not. I find this question of looking at, especially when people from one discipline are trying to use data from another discipline, and then of course they would cite it in their research. I'm wondering if people tend to be more hesitant to add those kinds of citations to data sets, even though they may have downloaded a data set from another discipline, tried it out, etc., but they are unsure about what to make out of what came out of their analysis, so they don't even mention it in the paper. Whereas if we think about publications and papers and from journal articles, etc., I think the barrier is somehow lower, or at least I reflect from my own experience as a researcher many years ago, that you would still, you would read a paper that might be tangentially connected to the research you're doing, and you still would pick out some point from it, and then you would mention it in the paper, and of course add it to the bibliography so that it was a true citation. But so maybe we are missing a lot of, we cannot capture the actual research practice of this interdisciplinary, cross-disciplinary, whatever research just by looking at citations. But of course, it's the counting of the citations that's the focus of this group, and that's why I was a bit hesitant to speak out.
I think it's an interesting point anyway to think about what is being missed. I think that's always worth thinking about, just from my perspective. But I think maybe through, maybe not a bibliometric approach, but in actually more qualitative types of research with interdisciplinary researchers, there might be evidence of that comes out. And that's, I think, a benefit of the type of approach we have in the Meaningful Data Counts project, is we're combining these different methods.
Thanks.
Okay, I think probably for the next part, Rachel, you are sharing your screen.
Yes, I am. So,
and Kathleen, thanks a lot for the
Kathleen,
interesting presentation and discussion. Before I just move on to the next part, that was really good.
No, it was excellent. There's so much to think about. I know that subject classifications and discipline stuff is something that we get asked about at Crossref all the time. So, you know, without creating a whole new group of this, it's certainly something that merits a collaborative approach. Can you see my screen okay? Cool. So we wanted to leave some time for discussion, and just for context, the last plenary we did a quick Mentimeter poll in the session, and we talked about some of the things that we thought were really kind of what kind of the priorities for Scholix. I know certainly from my side at Crossref and from the publisher side, there's as Scott described, you know, that there are still pieces to do around adoption. We could certainly revisit and evolve the Scholix module and a host of other things. But one of the items that came up was extending Scholix to other types of research object, and we've been talking a bit about software in the working group as well. And Paolo, I know you wanted, you know, you've already mentioned that we'd like to talk about this on this call and get some initial thoughts. So can I hand over to you and let me know when you need me to progress the slides?
Yes, thank you. So I'll make this quick. This is just this slide just shows that there are good reasons behind these questions. So for the moment, what we are collecting as Scholix as part of the framework are only links between articles and datasets and datasets and datasets. Okay. What this means, of course, would require a deeper explanation, because understanding what is a data set or what is a publication in such a heterogeneous ecosystem as the scholarly communication is not easy. So we have, let's say, a fully fledged harmonization system that tries to do its best in terms of harmonization. But one aspect that came up is that today, data software as let's say, as a kind of research products, in a way, is included into the notion of data sets. This is not because we believe they are the same. This is really not the case, but because Scholix was born like that. And when we were collecting objects from data sites, from other sources out there, software was left behind the data set. So this table here gives you a deeper view of the kind of links that we have. These are bilateral, so you have to consider that if you have a dataset A and a dataset B, here we have A to B and B to A together. So these are bilateral, of course, relationships. As you can see, we go close to the beyond the 600, 700 millions, I think. And below you see how many products and objects we have that can be detected as data sets and software. As you can see, software is a minority with respect to the rest. We are counting as explicit pieces of software today. I think I should have reported the number rather than the below the 0%. I think it's 300,000. Okay, most of these are stored in Zenodo with the DOI. Some others come from other sources like BioTools and so on. So those are that we can classify as software or that are explicit text software. And many others come from the repositories like the institutional repositories and so on. So they are becoming slowly and incrementally, increasingly, I have to, not slowly, but there is acceleration process, part of the ecosystem. So scientists are getting used to publish them. For the same reason, they're getting used to cite them. And so if you look at the diagram, the cake diagram on the right, here you can see the number of links to software. We have a total of 293,000 links, I think. And the yellowish one come from software itself. So this means that we have relationship of versioning between the differences of software in many cases. The majority of them come from publication. And that's a clear example. And many of them come from datasets, but just a minority. So the idea here is that these are becoming more and more important for scientists, which I think are following up the open science practices, and so relevant to our study. So can you please go on to the next slide, Rachel? So the question here is, since there are so many activities around, including Force 11, we shouldn't forget to mention the new SRIA from the European Commission, where there's a whole chunk of the funding that is there to supporting research software infrastructure. Okay, so how to define the interoperability framework, how to make sure repositories are able to store software and expose it according to same guidelines, how to favor the archival of software, for example, through software heritage, what is called the Universal Software Archive, and so on. There are so many practices out there. The question here was simple from us, and was, shall we include officially software as a type of object to be dealt with via Scholix? That was the question. And we're actually here to ask you that. So Rachel, if you can please continue. So here is a number of questions for which we would love to have your opinions and answers, even solutions, definitely solutions if you have them. The first one is the one I just asked. So do you see the benefits of expanding Scholix to software? And if so, which ones? Would be interesting to know what you think would be the added value, explicit added value of having software. The second question is about metrics. If you think they are needed, it could be helpful to incentivize authors to cite software, because if we have software as part of this index, of course, we can come up with indicators and give visibility to those who are doing it. This follows up to the data usage metric working group, of course. So if there's anything that we can do there as an action. Then 3 is more, say, action-wise. So it's what and should the Scholix work with 4C11 repositories and publishers to promote linking? So what explicitly we could do, which repositories locations are and should be used to store your software. If there is, if we should come up with sort of thematic repositories or silos like product specific repositories, if we believe this is the case, and what should be the indications? Because I think software is a special case, right, in this sense, and should be dealt with as such. So there are specific actions that you need on software, on code, like versioning, etc. And this is where it should be maintained. But then publishing software is a different thing. So it's a good question. PIDs, there's a whole discussions in an RDA group on that. What are PIDs for software? If they should be implicit or intrinsic or extrinsic, that's how they call them. And where to reference the software in the article. These are very similar questions to the one we have for data, of course. It's the same kind of thinking. If we should deal with them as a special case, or if instead it should be dealt with, for example, as data is, or as part of the references, and so on. So that's roughly the set of questions we have for you. We'd be happy actually to have your answers, not just today, but also offline, if you want to think about it, because this is not a brainstorm that should end up here, of course. So I think I try to be as fast as possible because time flies. So, Rachel?
No, that was, it said really really helpful in terms of in terms of context. And it said, I think this is something that obviously will be, that is open to discussion with people who are involved in this area, some of whom we've mentioned. And I've got a short poll which I'll share as well to cover some of these. But I think I think we've got some time for comments. Lorenzo, I know, Sasha, I can see that your hand's up. Lorenzo, I know that you had some as well. So Sasha, maybe if you start us off and then I'll go to Lorenzo next.
Sure. Yeah, I'm Sasha Schwartzman. I work with Scott Dainin at Optica as a content technology architect. And just briefly, I wanted to say that in addition to data citation, we have implemented code citation because we wanted to define code as something more specific than software in general. Software is never nebulous. And I won't go through all those 6 items, but we do see a benefit of citing code. We cite it in the references, and we follow 4C11 recommendation to do so. And if we do think that adding code citations is beneficial, could be beneficial for researchers to give them credit. And from our perspective, we would encourage both Scholix and Crossref to add code or software as an additional citation type, so that we could make use of the intellectual effort we made to tag and identify the code citation as such.
Cool. No, thanks. Thanks, Sasha. No, duly noted. And I know that we've, again, my colleague Patricia Feeney has been involved in the Force 11 work, and hopefully in terms of sort of accepting kind of typed citations in the Crossref metadata, we'll be able to support software at the same time as data, rather than sort of finish one and start in the other. Lorenzo, can I pass over to you?
Yeah, no, I want to say that what Paulo shared really summarizes my view as well. Quite honestly, I'm more keen to hear what the practitioners had to say. So I was keen to be here to, to hear from others, from the practitioners, what you think about this, whether this is a good next step for Scholix, whether it's worth the wild investment in time and efforts.
Cool. So I think you can feel free to put comments into the chat or into the shared notes document, or I think, as Paulo said, you can also you can also think about this and come back to it later. That's also a valid option.
I would be curious to know, though, whether we should interpret the lack of feedback now as a lack of interest, or a genuine needs to reflect on this. Again, I guess that a very important question we need to answer is this a meaningful direction for Scholix to take next, or whether we should rather invest our energies in the adoption of the current Scholix. So any feedback, whether this is relevant work in your opinion or not, would be really great.
No, cool. So the other thing I posted a link to in is a link to a Slido poll, which again sort of is sometimes kind of a fairly kind of light touch way in terms of just being able to give a bit of initial feedback. As said, I think the hopefully you can see that on my screen, or you can just go to slido.com and enter that number. So if you want to navigate to that, have a think about, as Lorenzo said, the kind of things that you would want us to focus on. We'll certainly try to do a bit of everything, which is coming across. And I've got a specific one as well. So Katie, thanks for your comment about entities that are a combination of data and software. As you said, I think these things often just don't sit as, these don't sit as sort of, these often don't sit as distinct things. And yeah, as Paulo said, the sort of research objects classification, I think, is trying to do sensible things with that information. But yeah, so I'm going to say, I think sort of broad support for extending to other types of research object. I'll give this just a couple of seconds more and then just move on to the next question. Again, if you still want to think, I'll leave the poll open for a bit. Okay, so the next question is about Scholix for specifically for software. Again, just a couple of sort of fairly kind of high level questions if you want to share your thoughts. It said again, as Paulo said, the thinking is certainly that we know that there are other groups involved in doing this, and there are a lot of kind of very sort of broad and bigger questions. But equally, sort of part of it is how we handle those links, those citations, that information via via Scholix and via those relationships. Paulo, Graham's asked a question. I sort of feel like you're sort of the closest, to the point about Kathleen, sort of closest to the ground in terms of sort of using tools to harvest information from Scholix. Do you know of any other ones that you use at OpenAIRE or?
Okay, as OpenAIRE, we published this Open Science Lens. So it's a Chrome extension that you can also install as a widget in any site. And what this thing does is, for the moment, is only to detect DOIs in the page and link them to whatever is available in OpenAIRE, which may range to ORCID IDs, data, software, open access versions of the paper, projects, funding projects. So you get this window through which you have access to all the possible material linked to the DOI. Scholar Explorer is just the view of the OpenAIRE research graph about the links between the objects. But then, of course, there is more. So through this, you can, oh, sorry, I just wrote it only to Martina. I should write it. So take a look at this. And I think you also find there the links to the widgets. If not, tell me, and I can tell you where to go. Okay. For that, Python, we have a system, a brokering system. It's called a broker. So if you register your repository to OpenAIRE and we collect from it, then you have APIs through which you can download all the enrichments to your records by subscription, also by subscription notification. So you can decide what kind of information you would like to have about your IDs. They don't have necessarily to be DOIs. They can also be the OEI PMH identifier of your repo if you don't have DOIs. If you want, you can contact me and I'll tell you what to do or where to go.
Cool.
Graham, sorry, no pardon.
No, that's great. Paulo, thank you very much. Graham, thank you for the question. It said, you can see I posted sort of a final question. This is something that Helena and I have been talking about in terms of sort of useful resources that we can provide to help people with implementation, adoption, problem solving, all of that kind of stuff. So I'm conscious that we have to, that we're due to wrap up the session. I think RDA is about to, I think the sort of closing plenary has been shifted to sort of 15 minutes from now. So, but I think that we should wrap up there. Certainly, I'd like to say, obviously, thank you to all of the presenters who've joined us today. I hope that was. I hope that you were challenged with questions, and again, thank you for sharing what you're working on. You can see how sort of broadly applicable it is, and how many people are kind of struggling with the same things. So obviously, thank you to the co-chairs from the various groups who've joined us: Helena, Lorenzo, Paulo, Ian. I think Daniela dropped in. And obviously, thank you for everyone who's come along, shared questions, experiences, and participated in the Slido. We'll pick those up. I'll share presentations in the collaborative notes doc. But apart from that, said just to say thank you for your time. Enjoy the rest of your day, evening, morning, and if, as Helena said, if you're interested in being added to the regular group calls, drop that into the collaborative notes and we'll add you to those. But again, thanks for your interest, and to RDA for facilitating the session. Thanks all.
Thanks everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.